After waiting for what seems like an eternity, the Overwatch League Stage 2 playoffs are finally just a day away from getting started. I know I'm like the millionth person to say this, but this is arguably the best playoff bracket we've ever had. Not only do we have many of the league's best teams competing in some really intriguing first round matchups, but the storylines are good as well. These playoffs are sure to be one we will all remember for years to come. If you're like me though, it's kind of hard to contain your excitement, and waiting another day is going to feel nearly impossible. So I figured that a good way to pass the time until then would be to make a video regarding my predictions on the outcome of this stage's playoffs. However, before I dive straight into my predictions, here's a few things you may want to know heading into the playoffs. Thing number one that you should know is that the playoff bracket will be readjusted after the first round, meaning that the highest remaining seed after round 1 is going to take on the lowest, and then the other two remaining teams are going to face off in the second semifinal game. Another thing you need to know regarding the format is that the quarterfinals will be the first to 3 map wins, and both the semifinals and grand finals will be the first to 4. It's also worth noting that the maps being played on will be the same as the ones we saw for the entirety of Stage 2. One other thing you definitely want to be aware of is the scheduling. The games are going to be played Thursday through Sunday, just like with the previous stage playoffs. That pretty much covers all of the essential info that I wanted to share with you guys, so let's get straight into the predictions now. Here's a quick overview of what the bracket looks like. As you can see, we are starting off the quarterfinals with the San Francisco Shock versus the Shanghai Dragons on Thursday night. The Shock are coming off a historic stage where they not only went 7-0, but they also had a perfect map score of 28-0. So needless to say, they have been cruising through the stage while stitching together dominant performance after dominant performance. Every player in the starting lineup has looked extremely good. Super still continues to turn heads. Choyobin looks better and better every single game he plays in. Sinatra's arguably the best Zarya, then there's Moth and Violet, who are of course one of the strongest support duos in the league, and finally Rascal has made a case as one of the best Baptiste players in the entire league. The Shock are sitting pretty as the number 1 seed in the playoffs, and it's hard to imagine that many teams will be able to keep up with them. The Shanghai Dragons, on the other hand, are in a much different situation. They just barely squeaked into the playoffs at 4-3 and find themselves going up against a team they lost to last week. Things don't exactly look good if you're a Dragons fan right now, but we do have to look at the positives here as well. We all get to witness history when the Dragons continue their amazing story. This is their first ever stage playoff appearance. They have gone from an 0-40 laughingstock to a playoff contender. This will be a special moment that we will never forget regardless of the outcome. As for my prediction, well, I think it's pretty obvious already, isn't it? The Shock are simply the much better team right now. Granted, the Dragons did put up a fight in their game against the Shock last week, but a 4-0 is still a 4-0. At the end of the day, the Shock are playing at a different level right now. They have the advantage in every single individual matchup, and they simply look like the better GOATS team overall. That's why I'm picking the Shock to win this game 3-0. Game number 2 on Thursday will be the London Spitfire versus the Hangzhou Spark. This is without a doubt one of the most exciting matchups we'll get to see in all of the playoffs. Both teams have looked much improved since their struggles during Stage 1. The Spitfire fixed their incompetence on GOATS and even incorporated Birdring back into the starting lineup by putting him on break duty. And how about Gesture? Everybody made fun of his weak Reinhardt during Stage 1, but he showed noticeable improvement on that hero since then. Then there's the Spark. They were so up and down during Stage 1, and it was kind of hard to imagine they turned things around as well as they have. The communication issues regarding the language barrier between Gushue and his Korean teammates have seemingly vanished. This team in general just seems to be more on the same page with one another. They look a lot more comfortable and have been able to win some games in the clutch as a result. Them beating the Seoul Dynasty last week in a winner-go-home situation is a good example of this. Incorporating star DPS player Crystal into the rotation has also worked wonders. His Brigida and hitscan have been quite impressive. He has definitely been a big help for his team when he comes into play. This Spark team, who had reasonably high preseason expectations, is finally showing some results. As for how this game goes, I think it's kind of a coin toss. The Spitfire have been played with inconsistency in this meta at times, and I think that a hungry Spark team that wants to prove themselves could really give them some trouble since the Spitfire are just so vulnerable, especially if the bad version of London shows up. These teams also happen to match up pretty well on paper when it comes down to the individual matchups. Gushue versus Gesture in particular is an interesting one. Whoever has the better day could dictate which team wins the series. However, I think London has the slight edge in this one. The reason I say this is because the Spitfire tend to become a different animal in any sort of playoff scenario. Prophet and Gesture in particular tend to elevate their games to an even higher level, which shouldn't even be physically possible. Call it a gut feeling if you will, but I believe Prophet and Gesture noticeably outplay Gushue and Godsby. It's hard to go against London when you look back at their crazy playoff performances from last year. I'll take London 3-1. Moving on to Friday, we start things off with the LA Gladiators versus the NYXL. This has the potential, kind of like with the Spitfire and Spark, to be one of the best games of the entire playoffs. These two could very well end up having a hard-fought and evenly matched game. The Gladiators had an extremely successful stage after going 6-1, which shows massive improvement when compared to their Stage 1 selves. Roar and Decay have fit into this team very nicely and have both made large contributions to their team's success. Decay in particular has performed noticeably well on Zarya, ranking 10th in damage per 10 minutes and 9th in eliminations. The only noticeable issue with the Gladiators for me that makes you question if they're good enough to compete with the best is their strength of schedule. The only somewhat strong team they beat was the Dynasty. I'd say that everybody else they beat was kind of just decent at best. It's also worth noting that they got crushed by a struggling Boston Uprising team who also got reversed by the Justice in the same week. This game will be the real test for the Gladiators. Time to see how you stack up against one of the best teams in the league. The NYXL started off stage 2 in typical NYXL fashion by crushing the competition, but after a 5-0 start, a massive roadblock came their way. That roadblock's name is the Atlanta Rain. Not only did the NYXL lose to them in week 3, but they lost to them again just 2 weeks later to finish the stage at 5-2 and on a 2-game losing streak. The NYXL not being one of the top seeds in the playoffs is just bizarre. New York is in a very strange situation right now. It's hard to believe that this losing trend is going to continue against a different team in the playoffs since they do have the coaching and the talent to beat just about anybody in this league, but at this point, who knows what's going to happen. I think the Gladiators could very well end up giving the NYXL a run for their money. In my opinion, the NYXL just don't have the right mindset right now. You can tell that something was wrong during their game against Atlanta last week. I don't know if this team isn't on the same page or if they're just lacking in confidence. It could also be that they just don't know how to beat the Rain, but I don't know, something just isn't right. I see this as a game where the NYXL start off kind of sluggish, but then slowly build up their confidence as the series progresses, which is why I'm going with the NYXL 3-2. I see a scenario where they go down 2-1, but then rally back to win it. If the NYXL weren't coming off of an unusual stage, then I'd say they probably would win this game fairly easily. They have the better team. I also don't trust the Gladiators since they have yet to prove they can beat a top team in the league. And last, but certainly not least, our second Friday game and last quarterfinal matchup will be the Vancouver Titans versus the Dallas Fuel. The Titans are coming off of yet another dominant stage and still find themselves undefeated since joining the Overwatch League. It's hard for me to say much more than that because they're kind of just doing more of the same we saw from them last stage. There hasn't been much of a change. They just continue to roll everybody for the most part while almost always utilizing the lineup of Bumper, Janu, Salmonsu, Haxel, Slime, and Twilight. The Dallas Fuel are a bit more interesting to talk about since they did not make the playoffs during Stage 1. They had an opportunity to make it last time, but they did choke it away after being reverse swept by the Boston Uprising. This time things were different though. After looking good for their home crowd in Dallas, the Fuel carried their momentum into their final game, allowing them to clinch their first ever playoff berth of the year. They won the games they should have, but unfortunately found themselves in the same situation as the Gladiators, where they have yet to prove themselves against a top-tier opponent. The Seoul Dynasty and Vancouver Titans were the only notable teams that they played, and they lost both of those games pretty badly. A combination of their past failure against the Titans, being unable to prove themselves against a strong opponent, and Vancouver being a much better team leads me to believe this game will not be close, which is why I'm picking the Titans to win 3-0. Now that I picked the winners of each quarterfinal game, it's time to reconfigure the bracket. As mentioned earlier, the top remaining seed takes on the lowest, and the second highest and second lowest play each other in the other game, which means that the Shock will go up against the NYXL, and the Spitfire will be taking on the Vancouver Titans. Starting with Shock versus New York, I see this being quite the exciting game. The Shock do look like the better team right now, but the NYXL match up pretty well with them. Their tank line, DPS, and supports are all top players in the league just like with San Francisco. It's also worth noting that the Shock have never beaten the NYXL before, so they could add on another impressive accomplishment in this wild Stage 2 run they've had. Some people will not take the NYXL seriously in this game because of their past failure against the Rain, so they're more than likely going to pick the Shock to win this game without much resistance. I, however, don't see that happening though, because the NYXL are a team that tend to play better when they're doubted by others. Look at Stage 3 last year if you want a good example of this. The Uprising had an undefeated stage, and people were starting to think there might be a new #1 team in the league due to the heroic play of Gamsu, Striker, and Neko. We all know what happened after that though. New York would go on to dominate Boston when the two met in the Stage 3 finals. The NYXL tend to perform better when they play against a team that everybody deems superior. The players see it as a sign of disrespect, which makes them want to play with a chip on their shoulders. Doubt only motivates these guys, which is why I think this ends up being a fairly close series. I don't think there's a chance in hell that the Shock don't at least encounter some resistance. Although the NYXL could give the Shock a serious run for their money, I have the Shock winning against the NYXL for the first time in franchise history 4-2 in what should be a grueling 6-map series. The Shock are simply playing at another level right now, and it's hard to imagine anybody but the Vancouver Titans taking them down. San Francisco, in my opinion, is in a tier of their own alongside the Titans when it comes to the best GOATS teams. If the NYXL are an A tier, then the Shock are an S tier. I also believe that Shock have more motivation than the NYXL do since they want revenge on Vancouver and they want to pursue a perfect stage. The other semi-final game that would happen if my predictions from the quarterfinals come true is the Vancouver Titans versus the London Spitfire. I mentioned how London has looked much improved since the beginning of Stage 1, but I doubt it's going to be enough unfortunately. I said the only team who could beat the Shock is Vancouver, and I think the opposite is true as well. It's hard to imagine anybody but the Shock having a realistic chance of beating the Titans. I get the feeling that not even playoff profit and gesture will be enough to give the Spitfire any sort of edge. Bumper and Salmonsu can match them since they too tend to have above and beyond performances in the clutch. The Spitfire are too vulnerable and inconsistent for my liking. Vancouver has been the model of consistency, and they're without a doubt the best team in the league right now, if not the second best if you say that the Shock are a little bit better. I think the Vancouver Titans end up winning the series 4-1 though. Now we have the grand finals, and would you look at that? It's a rematch of Stage 1. We all get to witness the run back of the century in this one. The Titans are out to prove they're still the best team in the league, while the Shock definitely want to go out there and get their first ever stage title while getting revenge on the team they so desperately want to beat. There isn't much to analyze in terms of the matchups. We all know how well these teams stack up against one another, and we also know that both teams tend to play out of their minds in the clutch during late game scenarios. If I'm going to be honest, I think the deciding factor in this game could definitely be which team wants it more in the end, and I personally think that team is the Titans. I know at first glance the obvious answer should be that the Shock want it more since they're the ones who want revenge and to get the historic stage, but the history of the Titans tell me there's no way they lose this game. Not only have they been playing GOAT since their runaway days, but they have suffered defeat in the finals way too many times. The Vancouver players do not want to experience any more of these painful close losses in the finals. Just look at their history while being known as runaway during the early days. Look at all those second place finishes. They lost in the finals to Lunatic High during APAC Season 2, GC Busan during Season 4, and then they lost to the same team again during the APAC Premier Tournament. There is no way that the Titans want to live through that again. Bumper and Haxel have been there since the beginning. These guys have more than already had their fair share of heartbreaking losses. This extra motivation to no longer be regarded as the losers who just come up short every single time will give them the advantage they need over the Shock. Now that these teams know each other a lot better, I think we see a lot less mistakes from both sides, which is why I'm picking Vancouver to win the Stage 2 Grand Finals against the Shock 4-2. And there you go, guys. That's it. Those are my predictions for the Stage 2 playoffs. Make sure to let me know what you think down in the comment section, and feel free to leave your own predictions while you're at it. If you enjoyed this content, then be sure to like and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter and join my Discord server through the links in the description. Thank you all so much for watching today's video, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.